The research vessel, Curiosity, hung in the perpetual twilight of Garrix's atmosphere, its sleek hull reflecting the ethereal glow of three moons. Dr. Jason Marlowe stood at the observation deck, watching bioluminescent storms rage across the planet's surface. Each flash illuminated the twisted forest below, painting them in shades of electric blue and violet. "You're going to get us all killed," Dr. Amanda Turner's voice cut through his contemplation. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her face a mask of professional concern tinged with genuine fear. Jason didn't turn around. "The Zerdai haven't killed anyone in recorded history. Because we've had the sense to stay away from them." Amanda moved closer, her reflection joining his in the reinforced glass. "Jason, I've supported your crazy projects before, but this, the fear radiation alone, is a defensive mechanism," he interrupted, finally facing her. "Every scrap of data points to it. They're not monsters, Amanda. They're refugees. Tell that to the crew. Half of them are requesting transfers." Jason ran a hand through his disheveled dark hair, exhaustion evident in the shadows under his eyes. "Let them transfer. I'll go down alone if I have to. The council will revoke your funding." "The council," he said, pulling up a holographic display of his research, "hasn't bothered to study the Shurdai since they exiled them here. Look at these readings." He pointed to a complex wave pattern. "The fear response isn't consistent. It fluctuates based on proximity and emotional state. That suggests consciousness, not weaponization." Amanda studied the data, her scientific curiosity briefly overriding her apprehension. "Even if you're right, that doesn't make them safe." "Safe?" Jason laughed, but there was no humor in it. "We're researching alien species. When has that ever been safe?" The ship's intercom crackled. "Dr. Marlowe to the bridge. Atmospheric entry window in 15 minutes. Amanda grabbed his arm as he moved to leave. "Jason, please, at least wait for the security team from Central." He gently removed her hand. "They've waited long enough." On the bridge, Captain Rodriguez waited with the landing calculations. The stocky veteran spacer didn't bother hiding his disapproval. "Last chance to reconsider, Doc. We've got enough readings for a preliminary report." "Preliminary reports don't change minds, Captain." Jason checked the environmental suit readings on his tablet. "And minds need changing." Rodriguez shrugged. "Your funeral, but I'm keeping the ship at minimum safe distance. First sign of trouble, we're gone." "Fair enough." Jason studied the landing zone coordinates. The clearing sat at the edge of one of the largest Zerdai settlements, though settlement might have been too formal a word. From orbital scans, their structures seemed to blend seamlessly with the bioluminescent forest. "For the record," Rodriguez added, "I think you're either the bravest or the stupidest scientist I've ever transported." Jason smiled. "History usually has trouble telling the difference." The descent through Garrix's atmosphere was smooth, the ship's advanced dampeners compensating for the strange gravitational fluctuations. As they broke through the cloud layer, Jason got his first real view of the surface. The bioluminescent forest stretched to the horizon, pulsing with internal light. Massive trees twisted together in impossible geometries, their bark seeming to shift colors with each breath of wind. In his quarters, Jason made one final log entry. "Personal log, Doctor. Jason Marlowe, Xenobiological Research Initiative. Final approach to Garrick surface. 3 years of study have led to this moment. The Shirt-Eye civilization predates our own by millennia, yet we drove them to this twilight world based on fear of their appearance and their unique biological defense mechanism. Today I intend to prove that fear isn't just unnecessary, it's keeping us from understanding one of the most fascinating species we've ever encountered. If I'm wrong..." He paused, looking at the alien landscape through his window. "Well, Amanda can say, 'I told you so' at my memorial." The landing shuttle vibrated as it pierced the lower atmosphere. Jason double-checked his environmental suit seals, the familiar routine doing little to calm his racing heart. Behind him, the minimal volunteer crew, just a pilot and 2 research assistants, worked in tense silence. "Approaching LZ," the pilot announced, her voice tight. "Atmospheric readings are strange. Some kind of electromagnetic interference." "Expected," Jason replied, watching the forest canopy rush up to meet them. "The Zerdai settlements generate unique energy signatures, Nothing that should affect our systems. The shuttle touched down with a soft thud. Outside, the bioluminescent forest pulsed with an almost hypnotic rhythm. Tendrils of mist curled around the landing struts, glowing faintly where they touched the hot metal. "Last chance to back out, Doctor." Marlowe, one of the assistants said, a young researcher named Mike who'd volunteered despite his obvious terror. "No shame in being careful." Jason activated his suit systems, watching the heads-up display flicker to life. "Careful doesn't make history, Mike, but you're all free to stay here. I mean it. No heroics if something goes wrong." The airlock cycled and Jason stepped onto the surface of Garrick's for the first time. His boots sank slightly into the spongy ground, and he activated his suit's atmospheric sampling systems. The air was breathable, technically, but laden with spores and unusual compounds that would require further study. The forest loomed before him, trees twisted into shapes that defied terrestrial biology. Their bark seemed to ripple, patterns of bioluminescence flowing like liquid light through visible veins. The effect was both beautiful and distinctly alien. He took another step forward, and that's when he felt it. The first wave of fear radiation. Despite his suit's shielding, despite years of studying the phenomenon, nothing had prepared him for the experience. Pure, primal terror washed over him, every instinct screaming to run, to hide, to escape. Jason forced himself to breathe slowly, focusing on his training. "Fear response initially overwhelming," he dictated into his suit's recorder, proud that his voice barely shook. "But manageable. Definitely feels directed rather than ambient." He continued forward, each step a battle against his own instincts. The forest seemed to watch him, though he detected no movement. His suit's sensors picked up multiple life signs. Large ones, but they remained frustratingly imprecise. "If anyone's there," he called out, his voice amplified by his suit's speakers, "I'm Dr. Jason Marlowe. I'm here to learn, not to harm." The forest's bioluminescence dimmed slightly, as if responding to his voice. The fear radiation intensified, then unexpectedly retreated, like a wave pulling back from shore. Jason's scientific mind raced with implications, even as his body trembled with residual terror. He pressed deeper into the forest, noting how the trees seemed to form natural corridors and chambers. Not random growth, he realized, but architecture, living architecture that had been guided and shaped over centuries. The first glimpse of a shirt high was almost missed, a flash of movement, a suggestion of massive form melting into the shadows. Then another, closer this time. Their bioluminescent eyes glowed like distant stars, watching him from multiple angles. "Remarkable," he breathed, forcing himself to stand still as one emerged partially from the forest shadows. They, stood nearly 3 meters tall, with a form that seemed to shift between solid and ethereal. Patterns of light played across their surface, matching the forest's pulse. The infamous claws that had sparked so much fear in early reports looked more like crystalline growths, refracting the ambient light. Jason took a step forward, hand raised in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. The Zertai retreated slightly, the fear radiation spiking. But there was something else in it now, a different quality that his instruments struggled to quantify. "Curiosity," he realized aloud. "You're as curious about me as I am about you." The ground beneath him shifted suddenly. Not natural movement, but a deliberate change in the living architecture. He stumbled, trying to regain his balance, but the forest floor tilted further. Jason fell, tumbling down a newly formed ravine. His suit's emergency systems flared, cushioning his fall, but he still landed hard enough to knock the breath from his lungs. Looking up, he saw multiple shirt-eye forms at the ravine's edge, their eyes studying him with inscrutable intent. Were they testing him, attacking him, or had he simply stumbled into some kind of natural defense system? Before he could activate his suit's climbing assists, something moved in the shadows near him. A new Zerd eye emerged, this one different from the others. Its bioluminescence patterned slightly differently, its movements more fluid, more graceful if he dared apply such a human concept. It extended one crystalline clawed hand toward him, not in threat but in offer of assistance. The fear radiation from this one felt different, more controlled, almost refined. Jason's scientific mind noted these details, even as he made a decision that would change everything. He reached up and, with trembling fingers, disengaged his suit's right glove. The Surdai's eyes pulsed with what might have been surprise. The fear radiation wavered, uncertainty bleeding into its usual pattern. Jason extended his bare hand, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to run. Their hands met. The Zerdai's skin was nothing like he expected. Not hard or crystalline, but soft, with a texture like silk over steel. The moment of contact seemed to stretch into infinity, and the fear radiation stopped. Not gradually, not partially, but completely. In its place came something else, a sensation of connection, of understanding that transcended normal communication. The Shurdai's eyes met his, and in them he saw not a monster, not an alien threat, but a person. An individual with thoughts, feelings, and a name that somehow transferred directly into his mind. Nera, he whispered, understanding, without being told that this was who stood before him. A sound emerged from Nera, not quite speech, not quite song, but something between the two. His suit's translators struggled with it for a moment before producing, "You are either very brave or very foolish, Jason Marlowe." He laughed, still holding her hand. "I've been told that's often the same thing." The other Jedi moved closer now, their fear radiation dampened, though not entirely gone. Nera helped him to his feet, her movements displaying a grace that seemed impossible for her size. "You are the first to touch us willingly in 300 years, she said, her translated voice carrying complex harmonics that suggested deeper meaning. "Why?" Jason looked up at her, noticing how the patterns of light across her form created something like expressions. "Because sometimes the only way past fear is through it. Your people deserve better than exile based on misunderstanding." Nera's eyes pulsed with what might have been amusement. "And you believe you alone can change centuries of prejudice?" "No," he replied honestly, "but I believe I can take the first step." He gestured to their still joined hands. "Actually, I suppose we just did." The forest around them shifted again, but this time it felt intentional, welcoming. Paths formed in the living architecture, leading deeper into the Shurdai settlement. "Come then, Jason Marlowe," Nera said, finally releasing his hand. "Let us see what other fears you are willing to face." As he followed her into the heart of the bioluminescent forest, Jason activated his suit's recorder one final time. First contact established. All previous theories about fear radiation confirmed. It's controllable, conscious, and there's so much more to learn. The Zerdai aren't monsters. They're beautiful. His suit's sensors flashed warnings about elevated heart rate and unusual neural patterns. But for once in his life, Jason wasn't interested in the data. He was too busy watching how Nera moved through her world, each step creating ripples of light in the living architecture. Each gesture suggesting depths of culture and knowledge humanity had been too frightened to discover. The first chapter of his research was about to begin, and nothing in his years of preparation had ready him for the reality of what he'd found. Not monsters, not weapons, but people who had been waiting centuries for someone to simply reach out and touch them. The living architecture of the Zerdai settlement pulsed with newfound energy as Jason followed Nera through crystalline corridors. Each chamber they entered responded to her presence, shifting and flowing like liquid light. "Your structures," Jason said, reaching out to touch a wall that rippled beneath his fingers. "They're responsive, conscious?" Nera's bioluminescent patterns shifted in what he was beginning to recognize as amusement. "Semi-conscious, like your earth coral, but with memory." She placed her hand next to his on the wall, and the patterns synchronized with her own. "We shape them through resonance." "Through your fear radiation?" "Bioresonance," she corrected, her translated voice carrying a hint of sharpness. "What you call fear radiation is only one frequency we can project." Jason noticed how the walls dimmed slightly at her irritation. "I'm sorry. Old habits of terminology. Would you teach me the correct terms?" Her pattern softened. "You are different from the others who've studied us from afar." They name things before understanding them. Understanding is why I'm here. He withdrew his hand from the wall, noticing how the patterns followed his movement for a moment before fading. Though I admit, nothing in my research prepared me for this. He gestured to the living chamber around them. For beauty? Nira's translation carried a teasing tone. For complexity, he countered, though he couldn't help but notice how the shifting lights played across her form, creating patterns that seemed almost hypnotic. Your people were renowned architects once, weren't they? Before the exile? The chamber's light dimmed noticeably. You've done your research well. Yes, we built wonders across a dozen worlds. The singing towers of Centauri, the living gardens of Proxima, all abandoned now, all dead without our touch. Jason activated his suit's recorder, then thought better of it and switched it off. Some conversations deserve privacy. What happened? Nira moved to what appeared to be a control interface, a crystalline formation that responded to her touch with cascading lights. The chamber around them transformed, projecting three-dimensional images of vast structures that defied conventional physics. The war changed everything, she said, her patterns reflecting old pain. We were peaceful, but not defenseless. When the Drachnid Empire attacked, our scientists developed the bioresonance as a weapon. It worked too well. She turned to face him, her eyes pulsing with intensity. The fear response became part of us, encoded in our very being. A perfect defense that made us permanent outcasts. Jason stepped closer, noticing how his proximity caused her patterns to shift slightly. But it can be controlled. You're controlling it right now. With effort, her patterns flickered. And you seem increasingly resistant. Adaptation, he said, his scientific mind racing with possibilities. The human nervous system is remarkably plastic. With prolonged exposure, you theorize like a Zerdai, she interrupted, amusement returning to her patterns. Always seeking patterns. Is that a compliment or an insult? Yes, she replied, and Jason found himself laughing at the perfectly timed response. Their moment was interrupted by an urgent signal from his suit's communicator. Amanda's voice cut through the ambient sounds of the living architecture. Jason, we've got a situation up here. The council's received some concerning reports from the crew. They're talking about quarantine protocols. He saw Nara's patterns darken at the word quarantine. I'll be right back, he assured her, then activated his comm. What kind of reports? Some of the crew think you've been compromised. They're citing your unusual biosignatures, your extended contact. Jason, they're throwing around terms like cognitive contamination. He glanced at Nara, who stood perfectly still, her patterns barely visible. That's ridiculous. I'm conducting legitimate research with a sentient species. A species that can affect minds, Amanda countered. Look, I'm on your side, but you need to give me something. Data, readings, anything to show this is safe. Jason felt frustration building. Safe? When has first contact ever been safe? We're on the verge of understanding something remarkable here. The Surdai aren't just survivors, they're artists, architects, scientists. Then prove it, scientifically, before the council decides to prove otherwise. The communication ended, leaving Jason in uncomfortable silence. Nara's patterns had shifted to something he hadn't seen before. Concern mixed with something else. Your people fear us still, she said quietly. Fear of the unknown is easier than understanding. He moved closer to her, noting how his suit's fear response warnings had diminished to almost nothing. Help me change that. Show me everything. Your history, your science, your art. Let me show them what I'm seeing. Her patterns brightened slightly. And what are you seeing, Jason Marlowe? He met her gaze, aware of how close they were standing. Beauty hidden by fear, a civilization waiting to be rediscovered. He smiled. And someone who enjoys testing my theories almost as much as I enjoy proposing them. The living architecture around them pulsed with sudden warmth, and Nara's patterns shifted to a configuration he hadn't seen before. Perhaps, she said, her translated voice carrying new harmonics, we should begin your education with how Surtai deal with presumptuous humans. Jason's suit sensors registered a subtle shift in the bioresonance field as Nara led him deeper into the settlement. The living architecture responded to their passage, creating spaces that seemed to blend seamlessly between exterior and interior. My research assistants, Jason said suddenly, remembering Mike and the other scientist, Dr. Emily Parker, who'd remained in the shuttle. I should check on them. Your companions retreated to your ship shortly after your fall. Nera's translated voice carried a note of what might have been disappointment. Their fear overwhelmed them. Not all are as adaptable as you. Jason activated his comm. Mike? Emily? Status report. We're back on the Curiosity, Mike's voice crackled through. Sorry, Doc, but that radiation, it was too much. Emily nearly had a panic attack. But we're monitoring your signals. You're still reading stable somehow. More than stable, Jason replied, watching as Nera manipulated another crystalline interface, causing a chamber to form around them. I'm about to witness something extraordinary. Keep the channels open for data transmission. The chamber Nera had created was unlike anything he'd seen before. The walls thrummed with complex patterns of light that seemed to respond to thought itself. At its center stood what appeared to be a three-dimensional, artistic rendering of the Shird-Eye homeworld before their exile. Your original world, Jason breathed, stepping closer to the hologram. It's beautiful. Was beautiful, Nera corrected, her patterns reflecting a deep melancholy. Now it stands empty, its living architecture slowly dying without our touch. She moved beside him, her tall form casting shifting shadows through the holographic display. This is what the fear response cost us. Jason noticed how close they were standing, how the fear radiation had diminished to almost nothing between them. Tell me about it, about your world, your people. Help me understand. Nera's patterns shifted to something more contemplative. Our people were artists first, warriors second. The bioresonance was meant to be temporary, a defense to save our culture. Her hand moved through the hologram, adjusting the image to show vast cities that seemed to grow from the ground itself. We never imagined it would become permanent, that it would change us at such a fundamental level. But you can control it, Jason pointed out, consciously stepping closer. You're controlling it now. Her patterns flickered in what he was beginning to recognize as laughter. Perhaps you simply no longer fear me, Jason Marlowe? Oh, I fear you, he said with a slight smile. Just not in the way your bioresonance intended. The hologram shifted, responding to Nera's suddenly brightened patterns. You speak dangerously for a scientist. I find dangerous speech often leads to interesting discoveries. Their exchange was interrupted by another call from the Curiosity. This time it was Amanda, her voice tense. Jason, we've got a problem. The Council's demanding immediate data transmission on the Shird-Eye bioresonance. They're citing potential weapons applications. Jason felt Nera stiffen beside him, her patterns darkening. Send them the preliminary scans, he replied, but make it clear this is a cultural exchange mission, not weapons research. They're not going to accept that, Amanda warned. And some of the crew, they're talking about quarantine protocols. They think prolonged exposure to the bioresonance might be affecting your judgment. My judgment is fine, Jason said sharply, then softened his tone. The CERT AI aren't weapons, Amanda. They're people. Brilliant, complex people who developed an ability that others turned into a reason to fear them. Nera's patterns had shifted to something he couldn't read. Your colleague fears for you. Amanda worries about everything. It's what makes her a good scientist. He turned to face Nera fully. But she's wrong about this. About you. The chamber's lights pulsed softly, matching Nera's patterns. And what makes you so certain? Jason gestured to the hologram still showing their lost world. Because weapons don't create beauty like this. Weapons don't preserve history through living architecture or develop ways to communicate through light and resonance. He met her luminescent gaze. Weapons don't look at someone the way you're looking at me right now. Her patterns shifted rapidly, creating a cascade of light that the chamber's walls reflected and amplified. And how am I looking at you, Doctor? Marlowe? Like someone who's tired of being seen as a monster, he said softly, like someone who wants to be understood. The bioresonance between them changed, becoming something entirely different from the fear response, something warmer, more intimate. The chamber's architecture responded, creating patterns that seemed to dance between them. Understanding, Nera said, her translated voice carrying new harmonics, can be more dangerous than fear. Then let's be dangerous together. Jason reached up, beginning to disengage his helmet. Show me your world, Nera. All of it. Help me show everyone what they've been too afraid to see. Her patterns brightened with alarm. The atmosphere is breathable according to my scans. Slightly higher oxygen content than Earth normal. Trace elements well within tolerable ranges. He removed the helmet, taking his first unfiltered breath of Garrix's air. It was sweet, almost intoxicating, with hints of something that reminded him of rain on warm Earth. Nera's patterns swirled with concern, and something else. Admiration, perhaps? You take many risks, Jason Marlowe. He smiled, feeling the bioresonance wash over him directly for the first time without his suit's filtration. It was overwhelming but not unpleasant. More like standing too close to a powerful speaker, feeling the vibrations in his bones. Risk is required for discovery, he said, his voice slightly strained as he adjusted to the sensation. And I think we have much to discover about each other. The chamber's lights pulsed in harmony with Nera's patterns, creating a display that made the previous ones seem simple by comparison. She moved closer, her tall form towering over him, yet somehow not intimidating despite their size difference. Then let us begin your education properly, she said, extending her hand, starting with how the third eye truly communicate. As Jason took her hand, feeling that silk over steel texture again, he knew he was crossing a line that would make his fellow researchers question everything about his objectivity. But watching how Nera's patterns responded to his touch, how the very architecture around them seemed to sing with possibility, he couldn't bring himself to care. Sometimes understanding required more than observation. Sometimes it required surrender to the unknown. And as Nera began to teach him the true language of light and resonance, Jason knew he was falling into something far more complex than mere scientific discovery. He was falling into a new way of seeing the universe itself, guided by someone who had been waiting centuries for someone to simply look past the fear and see the beauty within. The next few days transformed Jason's understanding of the third eye completely. Under Nera's guidance, he learned their true language, a complex symphony of light patterns, bioresonance, and subtle energetic shifts that made human speech seem primitive by comparison. You're projecting too strongly, Nera said, her patterns flickering with amusement as Jason attempted to manipulate the living architecture. His clumsy efforts had caused a wall to bulge rather than flow. The resonance requires finesse, not force. I'd have better luck if you weren't deliberately distracting me, Jason replied, noting how her own patterns had shifted to what he now recognized as a teasing configuration. The way she moved around him had become increasingly graceful, almost dance-like. Distraction? Her translated voice carried harmonics of innocence that fooled nobody. I'm merely teaching. Their exchange was interrupted by the arrival of another Shurtai, Vexthor, one of their lead scientists. His massive form moved with deliberate precision, his patterns indicating both curiosity and concern. The human ship above grows restless, Vexthor's translation came through. More vessels approach. Council vessels. Jason's moment of levity vanished. Already? They're not supposed to send an inspection team for another week. Nera's patterns darken. They fear what they do not understand, as always. Then let's make them understand. Jason activated his comm. Amanda, are you receiving my latest data transmission? Yes, and it's fascinating, Amanda's voice crackled through. The bioresonance patterns, the architectural responses. Jason, this could revolutionize our understanding of xenobiology. But what? Dr. Parker's been sending her own reports to the council. She's claiming the third eye are actively manipulating our perceptions, that your growing immunity to the fear response is evidence of neural tampering. Jason felt Nera stiffen beside him, her patterns expressing something between anger and hurt. That's ridiculous. The adaptation is natural, documented in my readings. The council's not interested in readings, Amanda warned. They're talking about quarantine protocols. Emily's got half the crew convinced you're compromised. Vexthor's patterns pulsed with ancient pain. It begins again, as it always has. No, Jason said firmly, reaching out to touch Nara's arm. Her patterns rippled at the contact. Not this time. We have proof now. Real scientific evidence of the Shirdai's true nature. We just need time to present it properly. Time, Nara's translation carried bitter harmonics, is something the Council rarely grants our kind. A new voice cut through the calm. Captain Rodriguez. Dr. Marlowe, we've got 3 Council vessels entering the system. They're demanding immediate evacuation of all research personnel. On what grounds? Jason demanded, even as Nara's patterns shifted to something he'd never seen before. Fear, but not the artificial kind their bioresonance projected. Real fear. They're citing Regulation 17B. Rodriguez replied grimly. Containment of potentially hostile xenobiological influences. Hostile? Jason laughed harshly. They're artists, architects, scientists. They've shown us nothing but patience and wisdom while we treat them like monsters. He felt Nara's hand on his shoulder, her touch sending cascades of sensation through him that had nothing to do with fear radiation. Your passion honors us, she said softly, but we will not see you harmed for our sake. I'm not leaving, he said firmly, turning to face her. Not when we're so close to breakthrough. The bioresonance adaptation, the architectural interfaces, we're on the verge of proving everything I've theorized about your people. Vexthor's patterns shifted to show surprisingly human resignation. Perhaps it is time to show him the archive. Nara's patterns flared with shock. The Council forbade. The Council, Vexthor interrupted, has already judged us. Again, but this human, he sees with different eyes. Perhaps it is time to trust in that sight. Jason looked between them, sensing the weight of unspoken history. What archive? Nara's patterns swirled with conflict before settling into determination. Our true history, the reason for the bioresonance, the war that changed everything. She extended her hand to him. Come, if we are to be judged again, let it be with full understanding. As Jason took her hand, feeling the now familiar silk-over-steel texture of her skin, he noticed how their bioresonance fields had begun to synchronize. It wasn't just adaptation, he realized. It was something deeper, more fundamental. Lead the way, he said softly, watching how her patterns brightened at his trust. Show me everything. Behind them, Vexthor's patterns shifted to something ancient and knowing, while above them, Council ships descended through Garrix's twilight atmosphere. The race to understanding had begun, and Jason knew that what he learned in the next few hours would either save the Surtai from their exile or condemn them to an even darker fate. But watching how Nara's patterns danced with newfound purpose, feeling how the very architecture around them seemed to pulse with possibility, he couldn't bring himself to regret any of it. Sometimes the greatest discoveries required the greatest risks, and sometimes he was beginning to realize those risks led to something far more precious than mere scientific understanding. The deeper they ventured into the Shirdai settlement, the more the architecture changed. Gone were the flowing, organic patterns of the living quarters. Here the crystalline structures took on geometric precision that spoke of ancient purpose. The archive predates our exile, Nara explained, as they descended a spiraling path that seemed to glow with internal light. It contains the complete history of our species, including the truth about the bioresonance. Truth your people have kept hidden, Jason noted, watching how her patterns shifted defensively at his observation. Would you have believed us? Her translated voice carried complex harmonics of pain and pride. Your people barely trust us now, with centuries of documented history. How would they have reacted to the full truth? Before Jason could respond, his comm crackled to life. Amanda's voice was urgent. Jason, the Council ships are entering orbit. Dr. Parker is pushing for immediate extraction. She's convinced the Surtai are affecting you somehow. Emily's letting fear cloud her judgment, he replied sharply. Tell her, Nara interrupted, her patterns pulsing with sudden intensity, that she is welcome to come see for herself. The archive holds answers for all who dare to look. Jason stared at her. Are you sure? The Council has already judged us, she said, her massive form somehow managing to convey grace, even in stillness. Perhaps it's time to judge them in return. The invitation was transmitted, and to Jason's surprise, both Amanda and Emily agreed to descend in a shuttle. Even Captain Rodriguez decided to join them, citing protocol but radiating curiosity. As they waited in the archive's entrance chamber, Jason found himself studying Nera's patterns. They had changed subtly since he first met her, becoming more expressive, more personal. "You're staring," she noted, her patterns shifting to what he now recognized as amusement. "I'm observing," he corrected with a smile. "It's what scientists do." "And what do you observe, Doctor?" "Marlowe." The way she said his title carried harmonics that made his skin tingle. "I observe someone who's tired of hiding, who wants to be seen for what she truly is." Her patterns rippled in a way he hadn't seen before, something between pleasure and vulnerability. Dangerous observations. The best kind. Their moment was interrupted by the arrival of the shuttle. Amanda emerged first, her environmental suit sensors already whirring. Emily Parker followed, her movements stiff with barely contained fear. Captain Rodriguez brought up the rear, his military bearing at odds with the obvious wonder in his expression. "My God," Amanda breathed, staring at the crystalline architecture. "The readings. They're incredible." Emily's voice was tight. "The fear response is stronger here, more focused." "Because this place holds truth," Nera said, stepping forward. Her massive form caused Emily to flinch, but Amanda and Rodriguez stood their ground. "And truth is often frightening." The archive's entrance dissolved, revealing a vast chamber that defied conventional physics. Crystalline structures spiraled in impossible geometries, each facet containing what appeared to be living memories. "Welcome," Nera's translated voice echoed with formal tones, "to the true history of the Third Eye." The chamber came alive with light and memory. The first images showed the Third Eye as they were before, builders of wonders, shapers of worlds. Their bioresonance was pure creativity then, used to shape living architecture into forms that took Amanda's breath away. "The singing towers," she whispered, recognizing the legendary structures. "They were real. Real and alive," Nera confirmed, "until the Drachnid Empire came." The images shifted, showing scenes of devastation. The Drachnid, massive insectoid beings, swarmed across Shirtai worlds, destroying everything in their path. "We were peaceful," Nera continued, her patterns reflecting old pain. "But we were not defenseless. Our scientists discovered that our bioresonance could be modified, turned from creation to protection. The memories showed the transformation, how the Third Eye's natural ability to shape reality through resonance was weaponized into the fear response. It worked too well. The Drachnid fled, but the change became permanent, encoded into their very being. "The modification altered us at a genetic level," Nera explained, moving closer to Jason. "Each generation born with stronger fear projection until the galaxy feared you too much to see you clearly," Jason finished softly. Emily shook her head, though her stance had relaxed slightly. "This doesn't change the fact that you're still affecting us. The fear response can be overcome," Jason interrupted. "Look at me. Look at how I've adapted. It's not manipulation, it's natural neuroplasticity." "He's right," Amanda said, checking her readings. "The fear response doesn't override conscious thought. It only triggers automatic reactions. With exposure and understanding." Captain Rodriguez removed his helmet, causing everyone to stare. "Sometimes," he said gruffly, "you have to trust your gut over your fear." Nera's patterns brightened with hope, but before she could respond, new alarms blared from above. The council ships had begun atmospheric entry. "They're not waiting for our report," Amanda said grimly. "They're implementing quarantine protocols now." Jason felt Nera's patterns shift to something both fierce and protective. "They cannot separate us from the living architecture," she said, "not without destroying everything." "Then we don't let them try." Jason turned to his colleagues. "You've seen the truth. Will you help us show it to others?" Emily hesitated, then nodded slowly. "The data is compelling. If we can demonstrate the adaptation process..." We'll need more than data, Rodriguez said. We need a demonstration they can't ignore. Nera's patterns suddenly pulsed with inspiration. Perhaps, perhaps it is time to show them not just our past, but our potential. She turned to Jason, her next words carrying harmonics that made his heart race. If you trust me. Always, he said without hesitation. Her patterns rippled with something that transcended their usual communication. The archive chamber responded, its crystalline structures flowing like liquid light. The living architecture responds to resonance, she explained, not just ours, but any beings who learn to project it. Watch. She took Jason's hand, and suddenly he felt it. Not just the fear response or its absence, but something deeper. The true resonance the third eye used to shape reality itself. Under her guidance, he reached out with his mind, and to everyone's amazement, the crystals responded. A small section of wall flowed like water, forming a perfect replica of a human DNA helix. That's impossible, Emily whispered. No, Nera said, her patterns dancing with joy as Jason continued to shape the crystal under her guidance. That is potential, the same potential that exists in all beings, if they dare to reach past their fear. As council ships descended through the atmosphere, Jason and Nera stood together, their resonance fields harmonizing in a way that made the very air sing. They had found something more powerful than fear, understanding born of trust, and perhaps. He looked at her, seeing how her patterns had shifted to something uniquely personal, something meant only for him. Perhaps love itself was the strongest resonance of all. The council ship's descent rattled the archive's crystalline structure, but Jason noticed how Nera's patterns remained steady, almost defiant. Her massive form seemed to glow brighter in the face of threat, and he found himself admiring more than just her bioluminescence. 3 heavy cruisers, Rodriguez reported, checking his comm. Standard containment formation. They're not here to talk. Then we'll make them listen, Jason said, keeping his hand linked with Nera's. The resonance between them had grown stronger, more focused. Amanda, is your data backup complete? Full archive download, plus all our adaptation studies. She smiled grimly. They can't bury this one. Emily, who had been studying the crystalline formations with growing fascination, turned to Nera. The resonance control Jason demonstrated, could others learn it? Nera's patterns shifted to what Jason now recognized as her teaching configuration. Any species with sufficient neural plasticity could develop the ability. The fear response was never meant to be a barrier, but a first step toward understanding. Their discussion was interrupted by a booming voice from above. Council peacekeepers using atmospheric amplification. This is Council Executor Dram. The Zerdai settlement is now under quarantine. All human personnel must evacuate immediately. Resistance will be met with containment protocols. Jason felt Nera's patterns pulse with anger, but there was something else there too. A calculated precision that made him smile. She had a plan. Your executor speaks of containment. Nera's translated voice carried new harmonics. Formal, powerful, ancient. But you cannot contain what you do not understand. The archive's crystals began to pulse with increasing intensity. Around them, the living architecture responded, flowing like liquid starlight. Jason felt the resonance build between them, and suddenly he understood. Everyone, remove your helmets, he commanded. Are you insane? Emily protested, but Amanda was already following his lead. Trust the data, Amanda said simply, taking off her helmet. Her eyes widened as she felt the true resonance for the first time. Not fear, but possibility. Rodriguez shrugged and removed his helmet too. Hell, if we're going to start an interstellar incident, might as well do it properly. Nera's patterns danced with approval as she began to teach them all what she had shown Jason, the basic principles of resonance control. The archive responded to their combined efforts, its crystals singing with harmonics that made the air itself vibrate. Above them, the council ship's sensors must have gone crazy. The peacekeeper's voice returned, now with an edge of uncertainty. Unknown energy signature detected. All personnel must evacuate for decontamination. Show them, Nera whispered to Jason, her patterns intimate despite the crisis. Show them what understanding can create. Together, they guided the others in a synchronized resonance projection. The archive's crystals erupted upward, forming a massive holographic display visible even from orbit. It showed their shared history, not just the third eye's past glory and fall, but the recent moments of connection. Jason's first touch, the adaptation process, the successful resonance training. Council Executor, Jason broadcast, his voice steady. You came here expecting to contain a threat. Instead, I invite you to witness a breakthrough. The third eye aren't weapons to be feared. They're teachers of an art we've been too afraid to learn. Nera's patterns merged with his projection, adding depths of meaning that mere words couldn't convey. The fear response that had defined her people for so long transformed into something else, a bridge between species, a door to new understanding. Your containment is unnecessary, she declared, her translated voice carrying harmonics that made even the council ship's sensors resonate. We offer instead collaboration. The universe is larger than your fear of it. There was a long moment of silence. In that pause, Jason felt Nera's patterns shift to something personal, almost vulnerable. He turned to face her, aware that everyone was watching but not caring. Whatever happens, he said softly, I'm not leaving. Her patterns rippled with emotions that transcended translation. You never truly could, she replied. Our resonance patterns have harmonized too deeply. Is that a scientific observation or something more? He smiled, noting how her bioluminescence brightened at his teasing tone. Perhaps, she said, her patterns dancing with what could only be called affection. You need more data to form a conclusion. Their moment was interrupted by a new voice from above, different from the peacekeepers, carrying authority of a higher order. This is Council High Minister Venn. We request a full demonstration of this resonance adaptation process. The implications, if verified, could change everything. Jason looked at Nera, seeing hope and caution warring in her patterns. Ready to show them everything? Everything? Her patterns shifted to that teasing configuration he'd grown so fond of. That could take a lifetime of study, Doctor. Marlowe, I look forward to every moment of it. Around them, the archive sang with possibilities, while above, council ships moved from attack formation to landing patterns. The fear that had exiled the third eye was giving way to something stronger. Curiosity, wonder, and the first steps toward true understanding. And if that understanding was sparked by something more personal than scientific observation, well, that would be a subject for future study. The council delegation's arrival transformed the archive chamber into an impromptu diplomatic arena. High Minister Venn cut an imposing figure despite his small stature. A centaurian with crystalline skin that seemed to respond to the third eye architecture. Fascinating, he murmured, watching the resonance patterns play across the walls. All these years we interpreted the fear response as aggression when it was a defense mechanism that became part of us. Nera finished, her patterns carefully neutral. One that can be overcome through understanding. Jason stood beside her, noticing how the other council members kept their distance, while Venn approached without hesitation. The High Minister's crystalline form seemed to catch and reflect the bioluminescent patterns around him. Dr. Marlowe, Venn turned to him, your data suggests the fear response diminishes with exposure, yet your readings show something more complex. The resonance adaptation goes both ways, Jason explained, conscious of Nera's patterns shifting slightly at his words. As we learn to move past the fear, we begin to perceive the true complexity of third eye communication. Show me, Venn commanded. Nera's patterns flickered with surprise, but she stepped forward. You would risk direct contact? I risk more by not understanding. Venn's crystalline form pulsed with its own kind of light. Our fear has cost us centuries of potential cooperation. Show me what Dr. Marlowe has learned. What followed was a demonstration that left even the most skeptical council members speechless. Jason and Nera, working in perfect harmony, guided Venn through the basics of resonance perception. The High Minister's crystalline nature made him particularly receptive. Extraordinary, he breathed, watching as his own form began to respond to the archive's harmonics. The applications for this, the possibilities, Are endless, Amanda interjected, displaying her latest data. The resonance could revolutionize everything from architecture to medicine. Emily, who had been quietly running her own analyses, spoke up. The fear response itself appears to be an unintended side effect. If we could isolate the core resonance principles, you suggest modifying our very nature? A new voice cut through the chamber. Another Zhurtai, older, their patterns more rigid, emerged from the depths of the archive. I am Elder Kavor, and I must object. Nera's patterns darkened. Elder, the humans have proven their willingness to change us, as all others have tried to do. Kavor's patterns projected authority and ancient pain. Our nature is not a problem to be solved. Jason felt the tension rise, saw how Nera's patterns reflected both respect and frustration. He stepped forward, careful to show proper deference while standing his ground. With respect, Elder, no one is suggesting changing the shirt eye. We're talking about understanding you, all of you, including the aspects that others feared. Pretty words, human. Kavor's massive form loomed over him. But what do you truly know of us? A few weeks of study, some resonance games, and a fondness for one of our young ones does not grant you wisdom. Jason felt Nera's patterns flare at the implied dismissal, but he kept his focus on Kavor. You're right. I don't have centuries of wisdom. What I have is exactly what your people have been denied. The ability to see past fear to truth. The chamber's crystals pulsed with rising tension. High Minister Venn watched the exchange with evident fascination, his own crystalline form reflecting the swirling emotions around them. Truth? Kavor's patterns shifted to something ancient and challenging. Then let us test your understanding, Doctor. Jason Marlowe. Let us see if you truly comprehend what it means to bond with a Zertai. Nera moved suddenly, her patterns alarmed. Elder, you cannot mean... The resonance trial, Kavor announced, causing gasps from the other Zertai present. If this human truly understands our ways, let him prove it in the ancient manner. The archive chamber fell into a tense silence. Jason watched as Nera's patterns shifted through a range of emotions he'd never seen before. Alarm, pride, and something deeper that made his heart race. The resonance trial hasn't been performed in centuries, Nera said, her translated voice carrying complex harmonics of concern. Not since before the exile. What exactly is this trial? High Minister Venn asked, his crystalline form reflecting the chamber's swirling tensions. Elder Kavor's patterns took on a formal, almost ceremonial configuration. It is our most ancient test of compatibility, a joining of resonance fields at their deepest level. Few survive it unchanged. Unchanged? Jason felt Nera move closer to him protectively. The trial creates a permanent bond, she explained softly, a harmonization of resonance patterns that cannot be undone. In our history, it was used to prove true understanding between species. And true intent, Kavor added, his patterns sharp with challenge. Many claim to understand us, Doctor. Marlowe, few would risk their very consciousness to prove it. Amanda stepped forward, her scientific curiosity overriding her caution. A permanent neural link, that's ... Dangerous, Emily finished. Jason, you can't seriously consider... I accept. The words left his mouth before he could second-guess them. He felt Nera's patterns pulse with a mixture of fear and hope. Jason, she said, using his first name in front of everyone, her patterns intimate despite their audience. You don't understand what you're agreeing to. The trial, it will change you. Change us both. He turned to face her fully, noting how her bioluminescence seemed to reach for him even now. Haven't we already changed each other? Her patterns shifted to something so personal that the other shared eye turned away in what might have been embarrassment. This is different. The bond. It's permanent, complete. You would always feel my resonance, as I would feel yours. Is that supposed to discourage me? He smiled, watching her patterns dance at his words. High Minister Venn cleared his crystalline throat. The council must officially witness this. If successful, it would represent the first legally recognized bond between a human and a Zertai. If successful, Kavor emphasized, the trial has broken stronger minds than yours, human. With respect, Elder, Jason said, not looking away from Nera, you're assuming I want to remain unchanged. The archive's crystals pulsed with growing power as Cavor began the ancient preparations. The chamber reconfigured itself, forming a circular arena where the resonance fields would be at their strongest. Last chance to back out, Nera whispered, her patterns showing both fear and longing. No one would blame you. I would. He reached for her hand, feeling the familiar silk over steel texture. Besides, I'm a scientist. Think of the research possibilities. Her patterns flickered with surprised laughter. You joke now, but the trial will either prove what I already know, he said softly, or kill me trying. Either way, I'm not running from this. From you. Around them, the archives sang with ancient power as the trial preparations neared completion. Council members and humans alike watched in fascinated tension as Cavor began the ritual words. Let those who would join their resonance step forward, the elder intoned. Let them face the truth of each other, unshielded and unafraid. Jason squeezed Nera's hand one last time before stepping into the ritual circle. Her massive form moved with grace beside him, her patterns now showing a determination that matched his own. The trial begins, Cavor announced. May understanding guide you through darkness. The chamber's crystals flared with blinding light, and Jason felt the world dissolve around him as their resonance fields began to merge. The last thing he saw was Nera's patterns reaching for him, beautiful and terrifying and perfect. Then everything changed. The merger of resonance fields felt like falling into light itself. Jason's consciousness expanded, merging with patterns of energy he'd never imagined possible. Through it all, he felt Nera's presence, not just her physical form, but the very essence of her being. Through their joining, he saw her entire life, the beauty of her childhood among the living architecture, the pain of exile, the centuries of loneliness, and then him. He saw himself through her eyes, the first being in generations to reach past fear and truly see her. Jason, her thoughts whispered across their shared consciousness. You need to let go. It's too much. But instead of retreating, he pushed deeper, embracing the overwhelming flood of sensation. Their resonance patterns began to harmonize, creating new frequencies that made the archive's crystals sing. Elder Cavor's patterns registered shock. Impossible. He's not just surviving the merger. He's completing it. Through their connection, Jason felt Nera's joy, her fear, her growing realization that this was more than just a trial. Their resonance fields weren't just compatible. They were complementary, creating something entirely new. High Minister Ven's crystalline form vibrated in response to the harmonics they generated. The readings, this proves everything. The Surdai aren't just capable of connection, they're essential to it. The trial reached its crescendo as their merged consciousness touched the deepest levels of resonance. Jason saw the true history of the Surdai, not just their exile, but their potential future. A future he was now irrevocably part of. When the light finally faded, Jason found himself standing in the circle, changed but whole. Nera's patterns had merged slightly with his own neural signature, creating a permanent bridge between their consciousness. Well, he managed, feeling their new connection hum with shared emotion. That was certainly worth documenting. Nera's patterns rippled with joyous laughter, the sound enhanced by their bond. A scientist to the end. Elder Cavor approached, his patterns showing respect tinged with awe. In all our records, no non-Zert eye has ever achieved such complete resonance harmony. You truly understand us now. No, Jason said, reaching for Nera's hand. I understand her. The rest will take a lifetime of study. Fortunately, he smiled as their patterns synchronized. I believe I have a willing research partner. High Minister Ven stepped forward. The council recognizes this bond and, with it, the full rights of the Surdai people. The exile ends today. The archive chamber erupted in celebration. Amanda was already furiously documenting the readings, while Emily spoke excitedly with other council scientists about the implications for future research. But Jason barely noticed. Through their new bond, he felt Nera's happiness, her hope, and something deeper. A love that transcended physical forms and species barriers. Was it worth it? She asked through their connection, her patterns dancing with affection. Every moment, he replied, both aloud and through their resonance. Though I have to ask, did you know this would happen? That we were compatible at this level? Her patterns shifted to that teasing configuration he'd grown to love. Let's just say, I had a hypothesis that needed testing. You, he laughed, feeling their resonance harmonize perfectly, are going to make an excellent research partner. Around them, the archives sang with new possibilities as humans and Surt began the long process of reconnection. But for Jason and Nera, the future was already crystal clear. A shared path of discovery, understanding, and a love that literally resonated across the stars. The end wasn't really an ending at all, but a beginning. A new chapter in both their species' histories, written in the language of light and resonance, proving that sometimes the greatest discoveries come not from observation, but from the courage to reach past fear and touch what others called untouchable. Their story would be told for generations. The human who dared to touch a monster and found instead a soulmate, changing both their worlds forever. But that was just the beginning of their story. 1 year later, the singing towers of Centauri rose once again into the violet sky, their crystalline spires pulsing with renewed life. From the highest observation platform, Jason Marlowe watched as teams of humans and Surt worked together, their combined resonance breathing life back into the ancient architecture. Admiring our handiwork? Nera's familiar presence filled his mind before she physically joined him. Her massive form moved with characteristic grace as she wrapped an arm around his shoulders. Admiring the future, he replied, both verbally and through their bond. Their resonance patterns danced together in the way that still made nearby sensors short out. Though I have to admit, the view's not bad either. Her patterns flickered with amused affection. Flirt. Scientist, he corrected, pulling out his datapad. Speaking of which, the latest adaptation studies are showing promising results. 70% of human volunteers are developing basic resonance sensitivity within weeks now. And the fear response? Diminishing faster than we predicted. Turns out exposure therapy works even better when people actually want to learn. He gestured to where Amanda was leading a group of eager students through basic resonance exercises. Though no one's achieved our level of synchronization, Nera's patterns shifted to something more intimate. Perhaps because not everyone has our motivation. Through their bond, he felt the depth of her love, still as powerful as the day they'd completed the resonance trial. You mean not everyone's lucky enough to fall in love with a supposedly terrifying alien? Supposedly? Her patterns danced with mock offense. I'll have you know, I was considered quite frightening before you came along and ruined my reputation. Their playful banter was interrupted by the arrival of High Minister Venn, his crystalline form now permanently altered by regular exposure to Surt resonance. The council's approved the next phase, he announced without preamble, full restoration of all abandoned Surt worlds, with joint human Surt colonies to follow. Jason felt Nera's joy surge through their bond. A year ago, such news would have seemed impossible. Now, there's more, Venn continued. We want you both to lead the first colonial expedition. Your success has become something of a symbol. A symbol? Jason raised an eyebrow. Of what's possible when we move past fear, Nera finished, her patterns brightening, when we dare to touch the unknown. Through their resonance bond, they shared a moment of perfect understanding. This wasn't just about them anymore. It was about showing others the path they'd discovered. Well, Jason said, pulling up a new research file, I suppose we'll need to document everything. For science, of course. Nera's patterns rippled with laughter. Of course, though I suspect your field notes might be slightly biased. Biased? He sent her a wave of pure affection through their bond. I prefer to think of it as having a unique research perspective. Above them, the singing towers hummed with renewed life, their crystalline spires reaching toward stars that no longer held fear, only promise. The future stretched before them, filled with possibilities neither of them could have imagined when they first met. But that was the thing about love, Jason reflected as Nera's patterns synchronized perfectly with his own. It had a way of making the impossible not just possible, but inevitable. Ready for our next adventure? He asked, though he could already feel her answer through their bond. Her patterns danced with joy and mischief. With you? Always. Together they turned to face the horizon, their resonance patterns creating harmonies that made the very towers sing. The monster and the scientist who dared to love her, now writing a new chapter in the story of two species learning to see past fear to the beauty that lay beyond. It wasn't an ending. It was, as all good science recognized, just the beginning of a much larger discovery. Dear listeners, this story of Jason and Nira isn't just about aliens and scientists, fear and love. It's about something deeper that resonates within all of us. The courage to reach beyond our comfort zones and touch what others fear. We all face our own fear radiation in life. Those moments when everything inside us screams to run, to hide, to stay safe within the boundaries of what we know. But the greatest discoveries, the most profound connections, often lie just beyond those boundaries. Like Jason, we might find that what others label as monsters are simply beings waiting to be understood. Like Nira, we might discover that our greatest perceived weaknesses can become bridges to understanding when the right person dares to see past them. Perhaps you have your own walls built from fear, your own resonance waiting to be discovered. Maybe there's someone in your life who, like the Jedi, has been judged too quickly, feared too easily, and understood too little. Remember, every great breakthrough in human history began with someone who dared to reach out when others stepped back. Every meaningful connection started with a moment of vulnerability, a willingness to risk understanding over fear. You don't need to be a scientist like Jason or possess the ancient wisdom of the Surtai to change someone's world. Sometimes all it takes is the courage to extend your hand, to look past appearances, to believe that what others call impossible might just be unexplored. The real magic of this story isn't in its alien worlds or bioluminescent forests. It's in the simple truth that when we dare to understand what we fear, we often find not monsters, but mirrors, reflections of our own hopes, dreams, and capacity for connection. So go forth and dare to touch your own untouchables. Dare to question the boundaries others have drawn. Dare to believe that the most beautiful discoveries might be waiting in the places others fear to look. After all, in the end, we're all creating our own resonance patterns in the universe. The only question is, will we let fear define them, or will we dare to harmonize with something new? The choice, as always, is yours. Keep reaching, keep daring, keep believing in the beauty that lies beyond fear. And remember, sometimes the greatest monsters are simply wonders waiting to be understood. Sincerely, your storyteller.